Welcome to the show, Aleksander Czeszkiewicz. How about
Thanks
that for
for having me
pronunciation?
on.
Yes. Joining us from Poland. Where about in Poland are you, Aleksander?
On the north part of Poland, near the Baltic Sea.
Ah, yeah, in the Hanseatic League area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not far
Yes.
away. So, I got you got record. We got put together by a previous guest from a few weeks ago called Michael Laflemme. Who's one of my favorite guys to speak to because he just doesn't. He likes to go a little bit crazy, and he goes deep back into ancient history, and we talk about very cool stuff that most people would think you're a crackpot for talking about. However, I like to hear it. I think it's fun stories, and he brings as much evidence as is possible to find after such a long period of time, and so interested to talk about that. I've got some pretty good stuff, cool stuff to talk about. Also, we're going to talk about your book because you're a writer, an author, and a researcher. And the book is called, just let me get this right completely, is Deja Vu, Has Everything Already Been? There we go, on screen.
Yes,
Deja
here
Vu
it is.
by Aleksander Czeszkiewicz. Yes.
Yes, here it
Which
is.
you sent me last Thursday, as a PDF, and I said I'd read it over the weekend, but I forgot. I was in Florence, in Italy, for the weekend for a weekend, like a party, basically 2 nights, and so I didn't get any time to read. I was doing a lot of cultural stuff though, looking at old maps in museums. So let's crack on. The interesting thing for me about your story is that you wrote this book when you were 17. Now,
Yes.
when I talked to Michael Laflemme, we talked about Atlantis, and one of his sources is a channeled source. So a channeled source being that he effectively got a spirit took hold of him, the muse took hold of him, and this 17-year-old kid wrote this quite phenomenal book in 1880 something. And he talked about Atlantis. And the story was from 10,000 years ago, and this young, uneducated boy living in the far west in Oregon wrote this incredible book called A Dweller on Two Planets, which I have read, and it is incredible. And there's just no way you'd have the imagination to come up with this stuff, because he's coming up with stuff that wasn't even known. There was not even any discoveries. Atlantis, I don't think it really had been even really spoken about so much, because it was just, a myth, and it was just a story. So that's my question to you: is where did this come from? How did you get into it at such a young age?
My book isn't channeled or anything like that.
No,
like in the case of Frederick Oliver Spence, or how he was called, something like that. Yes, my book is mostly evidence-based, and for the first book, of course, I wanted for it to be fact-based, to be based in the material sources that we have gathered, that we can touch, that we can, have physically, not in some metaphysical heavenly realm or something. But of course, I am also into stuff like spirituality, metaphysics, and I can talk a little bit about it later. But as I mentioned, my book is mostly about the actual evidence, about the interpretation of this evidence, about how old is our history. And it started actually from like the earliest years of my life. I was at home in which there were some books, in which, we watched documentaries on the TV. So I was always well read, and I knew the basic stuff already from a very, very early age. But at that time, being like 5, 6, 7, 8, I wasn't like fascinated about that or something. I just, took it for granted, just cool knowledge to have, useful, of course, etc. I was always into geology. I was gathering rocks, minerals, and, while you're doing that, you always learn a bit about, the Earth, about the universe, because the rocks are not only about the Earth, but also about how the elements appeared in the universe, how the Earth formed, etc. So I was well read, and I knew just the basic general knowledge already at a very early age. And then I was just a normal kid, a normal teenager, until, because I was always good at school, I was always good at plenty of subject topics, but because there was a reform in education in Poland at that time, it was very hard to get into a good high school because they were eliminating some years they were adding, etc. It was a very chaotic period for everyone that was in the educational system. So in order to, be safe and go to a nice high school, not to some, bad and, to a little bit maybe malevolent high school, I went to a few historical competition because I was, I think, the best at history. I liked it. And it was always easy for me to remember some dates, some, names, some maps, as you mentioned, and stuff like that. And it was at that time, it was during my middle high school, between like about 14, 15 to 17, that I was learning tons about history because I needed to know the basic stuff, but also the more specialized stuff from the earliest prehistory, the Neolithic periods, and even before that, up until nowadays. And as I was learning that, and because I was not focused on a particular epoch like the medieval times or just the ancient times, just because I was focused on the entirety of history, I started thinking more about it. I started thinking about, the holistic, the big picture of how we see the past from the modern perspective of all the evidence, of all the things we've gathered, all the artifacts or the sources. And it looked like it was, a constant progress from some hominids, then to Homo sapiens, but in the form of a nomad hunter-gatherer, then to the first cities, then to the first civilizations, and then on up until the ancient times, medieval times, and finally until the modern times. Yeah. So it was fascinating me, but I was always interdisciplinary. I couldn't focus on one thing. I always wanted to see how it fits the bigger picture. So I also liked biology, physics, etc. And especially I liked genetics in biology. And when I found out that according to even conservative estimates of geneticists, human beings, just as you and me, like anatomically modern humans, appeared about 200,000 years ago, I mentioned to myself, wait a minute. If humans appeared 200,000 years ago and the first civilizations were from about 4,000 to 3,000 years before current era, we have a lost part, a lost episode of our history, because 200,000 years, first civilizations 5,000, 6,000 years ago, and then, first settlements 10,000 years BC, so 12,000 years ago, still 12,000 years ago, and 200,000 years ago is a huge gap of time that I thought, maybe those, because I think like most of us, people know about stuff like Atlantis, just they know that there is a mention of lost civilization. Maybe they do not know the details, but they know, Atlantis, some lost civilization, or Hyperborea or something, or some Hindu text, etc. So I thought to myself, what if those previous lost civilizations really existed? Because we have a potential for them to exist if we look at the bigger picture. And if we look at history, everything started 10,000 years BC with the first settlement, and actually it is still prehistory, because what we count as history is only after the invention of the first writing of the first script in ancient Mesopotamia, so about 4,000, 3,500 years before current era. But still, there is so much to our past that is not discovered, that I thought that maybe those stories of lost civilizations like Atlantis and others, maybe they are true, but we haven't discovered them yet. So, it was like parallel to my study of the only conventional history for this competition, which was very large. And parallel to that, I was, thinking, and I was researching additional material of how even we came about with our present view of the history, how our knowledge about our past evolved? How do we know about the previous civilizations? And I learned that like 500 years ago, we thought that Adam and Eve were the first humans some 6,000 years ago. We thought that the first civilizations were Greece and Rome. And 500 years ago, we knew almost nothing about ancient Egypt, about ancient Sumeria, and all the civilizations that predated ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So here I had like a true example of taking the roots of our civilization back. So if we took the roots of civilization back from ancient Greece to ancient Egypt, then from ancient Egypt to ancient Sumer, so what if nowadays or in the near future we will be able to take the roots of civilization from ancient Sumer to Atlantis or to other previous civilizations? It is completely logical. And interestingly, we nowadays talk that ancient Sumerians, the first civilizations, but we haven't discovered ancient Sumerians like we discovered them in the 1840s. Like it is less than 200 years ago, 180 years ago, we started discovering all the cities and all the civilizations from the area of ancient Mesopotamia. And before that, like before 200 years ago, we knew almost nothing about them. We had a few expeditions to those areas, but they never were so conclusive to tell us that whole civilizations existed in this region. And actually, we had plenty of stories telling us that in Mesopotamia there existed some previous civilizations. Even in the Bible, there was a mention that Abraham came from the Sumerian city of Ur. But in many ancient texts, there were mentions of either some cities or even entire civilizations, empire that existed in that region. But just because we hadn't found the remains of those civilizations yet, we were ignoring them when it comes to our view about our past. But then we discovered them and we started, expanding our view about our past. So as I mentioned, what if nowadays we are in a similar situation that we think that ancient Sumer is the first, for example? And what if before that there was something that we haven't discovered yet? And always people say, oh, ancient Sumer and all the civilizations were not only in myths and legends, but also in some historical texts. And we were stupid to ignore them, but they were in historical accounts. And for instance, Atlantis is found in Plato's dialogues, etc. But for instance, ancient Troy, found by Heinrich Schliemann, was, I would say, even in more mythical account of Homer than the actual account of Atlantis by Plato. So my take on our most distant past isn't that we should accept everything that all the channelers said, etc., but it is about that we do not know that much about our history, that we may still be ignorant about many of the sites. We haven't explored the entirety of Earth, of course, and I think that we should be open for the ideas that our past is much older than that, of the ideas that there were previous civilizations, and on many, many other ideas. So my intention of doing that and of writing my first book is to expand the horizons, to show that there are huge possibilities when it comes to our past, but also when it comes to the universe, when it comes to understanding the time and of the entirety of existence. And in my book, that's why I started actually my book, not with like historical stuff, but with the question, what would happen if nowadays like humans cease to exist? What would happen if, all the buildings, all the technology, cars, etc. would still survive, but maybe there was some, don't want to say because they may ban us, but some disease that would wipe out humanity, etc. What would happen? How would modern buildings, modern technology, and all of the stuff that we made behave? And it turns out that, we are constantly warned about, the climate, etc., that we pollute everything, that everywhere are plastics, wastes, etc. But if we look at the time of the decomposition of modern materials, it's just a few hundred up to a few thousand years. And after that, there would be almost no traces of everything. There would be some cases like, at the depths of the oceans, etc. But, if you looked from above, after 2,000 or 3,000 years, there would be almost nothing from our civilization.
Nothing at all.
Exactly. So why are we excluding the possibility of the existence of Atlantis or something previously, just because we haven't discovered it yet?
Yeah.
That's
the
the
thing is,
main
people
idea.
they want the evidence, right? And that's the easiest way is to be the skeptic and say, I don't, show me the evidence, and then I'll, so that is the problem we have, is it's very hard to show the evidence, especially when it's alleged to have sunk, but well, not alleged to, it was written down that it was sunk below the waves of the Atlantic. So interestingly, I've been to Ur in Mesopotamia in Iraq when I was there. I flew around it in a helicopter. But you talk about civilizations that we dig up, such as you mentioned Troy. There's been quite a few of those where people, funnily enough, usually kind of private money guys who have this idea to go and look in one particular place based on the research they've done, and they actually find what they're looking for, which is quite unusual, because you can't get the funding through university, because they maybe think that we're not looking for Troy because it's just a myth. So and it brings me to, which I've been following reasonably closely lately, is, have you heard of a place called Lake Van in Turkey?
Yes.
And it's, I think is it Jimmy Corsetti who's doing that there, or is it
no, Matthew Lacrosse and Paul Wallace, because
Matt Lacroix. Yeah,
yes,
so
because
so that's got basically it's in eastern Turkey.
Yes.
So let's call it Mesopotamia, because take away that border with Iraq and you're in pretty much the same place. And what they've got there is a lot of the buildings are under the lake already, so it's below the surface of the lake. But what they're finding, as is what you find all over the world, is unbelievably precise, precision cut, hard, very, very hard stone. And the buildings that, based on what's the base of some of these columns, the columns themselves must have been enormous. Don't know how big they would have been, but we're talking on a monumental scale. They'd be that big. So that's just been, as I say, discovered or being researched over the last few years. So that's according to Matthew Lacroix. He is saying that this is they're even older than even Göbekli Tepe, and if he's right, it's the ruins are of a higher quality, a higher architectural quality than those at Göbekli Tepe, which are actually reasonably crude. They're still hard to do. You're carving rocks into these columns, but there's a leap of civilization between what's done in Göbekli Tepe and what's done at Lake Van. Same as what you have in Peru, South America, these precision cut blocks, which is, we couldn't do it now. The logistics of it is so difficult.
I wanted to mention it now, and I opened my book because in my book I show plenty of examples of that.
Yeah.
And it is a problem I called because it is often called, even in the academic community, the Cyclopean walls. And in my book I've got plenty of examples from here, from Sacsayhuaman. These are even the older photos. I think that it is enough. These are the older photos, not photos. These were
sketches.
drawn down after, sketches just after, because I include them in my book because they are of no copyright, because they are so old. And these were just after the conquistadors visited the area, and they sometimes show more than modern photographs because, after the conquistadors conquered their lands, they often, used some of the blocks for their buildings, etc. But these are 100 or 200 years after the conquistadors conquered, so still long ago, and they show enormous boulders. And these are often called, even as I mentioned, in the academic community, cyclopean walls. The same walls can be found, as I mentioned, in the Lake Van. I've seen it recently. They are almost the same. In Peru, in all of the Andes, not only Sacsayhuaman, but there are plenty of different sites in the Andes, which are, of course, very, very high mountains, which is another very interesting thing, that, you know, all of those big stones are just not on some plain surfaces, like on some plains or something, but they are often high in the mountains. And
Very high.
they have a few things that I identified that are common throughout the world, because, you know, if you look at one stone and at the second and do not provide any context, you may say that it is, you know, just people used stones, but most of them are polygonal. There aren't like just cubes or rectangles, but they are polygonal. They have plenty of different angles. They are, as you mentioned, perfectly fitted, which is another interesting idea. You know, these huge stones, and they are perfectly fitted within each other. They do not often use any mortar or anything between them, just like in the like castles of the medieval times. Medieval castles actually also have huge boulders, but often they are not polished, not cut, just put there together. Even the bigger ones, just put and, you know, mortar between them, and this is how it works. But there are a few things: one, polygonal; two, no mortar often. Of course, the enormity of those stones, but also often they have knobs, like they aren't cut. They are cut perfectly, but they aren't like polished, finished. They have some knobs, and maybe these knobs were used, for instance, to transport them, to put, for instance, a rope or something, or some more advanced technology we do not know. But they have often the knobs that we find the same as we mentioned in the Lake Van, in Sacsayhuaman, in Peru, in Andes, even in
Japan.
Egypt. There are Japan. In Egypt, there are plenty of examples of them, and especially at the bottom of the Giza pyramids, especially the Menkaura pyramids. Recently it was excavated. They look almost the same knobs, the same style. And some of the temples nearby Giza, on the Giza plateau, like the Osirion, and Osirion is a temple nearby the pyramids that is a little bit below the surface, which often is interpreted by researchers that it is like much older, like maybe before that the surface level was a little bit below the current level, who knows. But these temples are often like below the ground, and in the Osirion there is also the same like architecture. If I was actually to have a photo of the Osirion in Egypt, or of those megaliths in the Menkaura pyramids, and just put it black and white without colors, and have a second picture of the Sacsayhuaman and show to you or most people, they wouldn't distinguish it
No,
even.
you wouldn't know the difference. It's funny
Exactly.
because I did a podcast with Michael, and we were talking about the Yuga cycle, and I want to go into a little bit for your book, because you're asking the question is you know, as it says in the Bible, there's nothing new under the sun, and it's we go through these cycles, and there's been rise and fall of civilizations, etc., etc. But there's, going back to the point you made about modern Homo sapiens sapien, us, basically going back 200,000 years. There's now, you know, there's discoveries in Morocco was going back 300,000 years.
Yes.
You know, when I was a kid, modern human beings were 15,000 years. We arrived 15,000 years ago when I was a young boy. And so it just goes back and further back. And then you probably know this guy, a guy called Michael Cremo, who wrote the book Forbidden Archaeology.
Forbidden,
so this guy went into a very deep dive, for those who don't know it, who he basically went into every paper which had anomalous stuff going back through written history that we've got. And he's finding reports of coal miners in the United States breaking up large pieces of coal and finding gold chains in a lump of coal, which comes from a strata of coal, which is 350 million years old. Now, how do you get your head around that? They find footprints with shoes with stitching, and you could tell it's a modern human foot, but it's been stitched together. It has a sole. These are found in, these have been preserved, and they are, again, tens of millions of, or 5-10 million years old. So these are the things that I start to get very excited and interested, because I think this is it's just too cool to not be able, and it's not just those several examples I've given. His book is this thick. It's something like 1,000 or 800 pages, and it's just one after the other of these stories of anatomically modern humans like ourselves, but much, much older. Much, much older. Now, the problem I think comes from is how we don't find, or very rarely do we find anything like this. We do, millions of years old humans, we do find anatomically modern humans like us in old millions of years ago. But normally we bury our dead in the soil, and the soil is wet, moist, and the bones just don't survive. Unless you're in Pompeo, or when the Vesuvius goes off and you get covered in volcanic ash. So that's I would want to make that point, is that I'm not a crazy man. This book was taken from scientific papers and newspaper articles of the day. So it's not me saying that, it's not him saying that. He's just going through all the research that's been done and collated into one massive book to show that there are tons of evidence to show it. So and I mentioned to you just before, we talked about, Atlantis, we've done quite a lot. I still think it's very fascinating. But then I found out there's older civilizations, one called Mu, one called Lemuria, and there's one called Hyperborea, which I'll be honest, I haven't gone into at all. I wondered if you knew anything about these, because these it's now getting very interesting.
Yes, so this is the same problem like with the older history that I mentioned at the beginning. And it's the same like archetypal or universal problem about the same people that want the hard evidence, that at the same time they are skeptical about all of the possibilities that we haven't discovered yet, but at the same time they often think that we know so much about, our history and everything, that we can exclude some things from the existence and we can completely rule them out. But actually, do we know that much? This is my question. Do we know that much about our past? And the same goes with Michael Crimmel and his Forbidden Archaeology. Some of the cases, but he has hundreds of cases, or even maybe thousands of cases, but some of the cases, of course, were debunked, and I've seen a few videos. But actually, it is like they often say that researchers of Atlantis, older history, etc., cherry pick the data, that I want this data, but they at the same time do the same with Michael Crimmel. He has a few hundred examples, for instance, and they take maybe 10 debunked, and they say, oh, it is all debunked. You know what I mean? Yeah. And it is also the question, because they say debunked, but it doesn't mean that it is always debunked, because we do just, in many cases, we do not know that much, even when it comes to dating. Is it 200 million years old? It is million years old or something. It is a large problem with dating, because most of the modern datings of the Earth, because of the universe, we can, for instance, calculate how the universe is expanding, and we can say that it is approximately 14 billions of years old from the Big Bang till nowadays, etc. But when it comes to any material remains, most of the datings come from radioactive particles. And radioactive particles, they are radioactive, they are decaying. And they are decaying at a rate. For instance, half decay of one element could be 3,000 years. So if in a given artifact or in a given something like object, we see that we have only 50% of this material, and we see that this material, this element, decays 50% in 3,000 years, we can say that it is approximately 3,000 years. You know what I mean? But the problem with that is that there are plenty of different elements that we use, because, as I mentioned, some particles have half decay of 3,000 years and others of millions of years. And again, it is only a half decay meaning that there is a probability for it to decay at that rate. But probability is a probability. Maybe it is very accurate, like 8 times in 10 times, like 80% accurate, but still 20 times it may be completely wrong because, it is only a possibility. And I've researched a little bit the decay of particles, and interestingly, such things like solar flares, like supernovas, like atomic bombs, etc., these things completely mess up with our datings because they often include external radioactivity which disturbs the particles. So actually I'm very, very conservative when it comes to dating. Again, dating of the mainstream and dating of the alternative history too. And I don't know, how old is our history. The same, I mentioned the conservative estimates of geneticists who mentioned that there was some fusion of chromosomes somewhere about 200,000 years, but still, plus minus 200,000 years, maybe it was 300,000 years, as you mentioned with the Moroccan stuff. And maybe the Moroccan stuff is a little bit dated wrongly, because often when it comes to dating this stuff, I mentioned it in my book, that I think after 10,000 or 12,000 years, if the things are older than that, there are like plus minus 3,000 years. The older we go, the more plus minus we see. So it is like 20,000 BC plus minus 4,000 years. So
Are you
it may
talking
be
about the margin of error?
yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. So if 20,000 years old plus minus 4,000 years, so it may be 24,000 BC and it may be 16,000 BC. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it is very hard to pinpoint accurate data the more far we go into our past, and especially that, as you mentioned, the less and the less materials survive. And actually, it is like probably a fact that 99.99% of all the species on our planet cease to exist because everything is constantly changing, everything is dying, everything is growing new, etc. So I think that we do not know that much about our past, because also you mentioned that some remains may cease to exist because of the conditions of climate, of weather, etc. And this is a fact. We see, for instance, some prehistoric mammoths in Berezovka, like in Russia or also in Alaska, that are so preserved that you can see the blood, that the blood is still there, that all of the hairs of the mammoths are still there because they froze to death, actually. So it froze, and it froze for many thousands or tens of thousands of years in some cases, and you can still see the examples. But in other cases, you see almost nothing because, for instance, in the temperate regions, when there is, it isn't like too cold and it isn't too hot to preserve anything, you have almost nothing. For instance, deserts and stuff like that, preserve conditions. Another way, I mentioned that I was always into geology, minerals, etc. And have you seen that most often any like dinosaurs or prehistoric plants that you can see on stones, they are most often in oil or in, as you mentioned, coal, because these are the materials that are air-proof, that they do not include oxygen in them, and that's why we can see, all these fossils of plants or of animals that are on those types of material. But you never see those types of, plants on other, like on crystals or something. And it shows us that it is only in a few cases, in a few types of conditions, that things survive to, thousands or tens of thousands, or even in some cases to millions of years, but the rest, goes and maybe is forgotten forever. So this is the problem with, you mentioned those, the same older history, Michael Kramer forbidden archaeology, and that's why, lost civilizations. Like you mentioned, you talked a lot about Atlantis. Atlantis was mentioned to exist 9,000 years before Solon, so about 9,600 years BC, which isn't that old ago. Even 200,000 years and 9,600 years, it is, still a huge gap, a huge possibility for Atlantis to be even 30,000 years BC. Maybe it started 30,000 years BC and, ceased to exist with the date of Plato or something like that. We do not know much about it, but I see here a huge possibility for, even like Michael Kramer mentions, after the Hindu thought that humans are millions of years old, really, because in the Hindu law there is that humans were millions of years old, and we did not know much about that. Maybe they were a little bit different species. Maybe geneticists are right that plus minus 200,000 years ago, genetically speaking, anatomically modern humans appeared. But what if those previous humans maybe were not the exact same humans, but other different species? There is a huge possibility to that. And I also mention a lot in podcasts and in my book that most of the ancient cultures were mentioning that they are either much older or they are the descendants of those previous lost civilizations. And, I was researching how old is our history, so I thought to myself, why are we thinking from the perspective of today? What if we look at our ancestors? They were closer to Atlantis than we are. Ancient Egyptians were 5,000 years old, so they were closer to Atlantis or to the lost history. So I started researching the lore, the myths, etc. And it is not only Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu. It goes much deeper into even mainstream. Because, for instance, ancient Egyptians in plenty of their sources are citing that ancient Egypt is about 36,000 years old before the first pharaoh, so it is like 30 plus thousand years old. The Sumerian kings lists are telling us of about 400 to 200,000 years ago that the kingship was lowered from heaven, and it is a little bit coincidental with the anatomically modern humans 200,000 years ago. Maybe some kingship was lowered to heaven, some extraterrestrials or something, and they created humanity. These are theories, but there is much more to our history. Ancient Hindus were mentioning even older history than that. So most of the ancient cultures were mentioning that the history is either older, when it comes to Egypt was older, or ancient Sumeria was older, or that there were previous civilizations that after the cataclysm were starting to rebuild the civilizations, and there are those stories of gods teaching like primitive humans how to not be hunter-gatherers and nomad, but to create settlements and stuff like that.
Yeah, I was flicking through your book. I read a couple of chapters, and I am definitely on it today. It's a holiday today. It's what is it, Pentecost, I think, in the Catholic parts of Europe. So here we go. That's where I am. And I was flicking through, and there was that picture, which is from somewhere in Egypt of, what's his name?
Akhenaten?
Akhenaten and Nefertiti with their little alien children. Now, so they're what we would classify from the head down, from here down, from the forehead down, they look human, but they've got the big, like from the movie Alien, they've got the elongated skull. Now,
yes.
So that's one of those things that you see in Peru. You find these mummies and they've got elongated skulls, and you think, oh, it's a hoax, or this is, they talk about this, it's a load of nonsense. But in Malta, in the Hypogeum, they found thousands of these skulls. And the interesting thing is that on human, that's the picture right there. Yeah. So it's basically an Egyptian pharaoh and his wife Nefertiti they've got their children on their laps, and they've both got the cone head look to them. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, but I think that it is not only their elongated heads, but also, like their hands and legs are also like elongated, like they were from some sort gum or something,
a different species.
Elastic. Yes, exactly.
So I've done a podcast about this, but I'm going to remake the point, because in Malta, in the Hypogeum there, we talked about this in quite a few podcasts. They found thousands of these skulls, and they used to have them on display at the museum, but now they don't, funnily enough. But there are loads of pictures of the time in the 70s when they were on display, and they had. So we've got looks like stitching up our skulls, and I forget. I used to know the term. Right now I can't remember what it is. The citral or something like that. Anyway, and on these elongated skulls, it's not. It's smooth, and they have a different stitching pattern where how the skull knits together. So that is, for me, very interesting. You find them all over the place. Okay, but who are these people? Are they a different race of humans? They are the ones who seem to have been venerated in deep history, because of the size of their heads, I must assume that their brains are bigger and they were more intelligent, which is what the writings say. So where do you sit on this one?
Yes, and it is the thing about, the mainstream. They laugh at people because, oh, they are theorizing ancient aliens, etc. But,
Didn't
these
say
are...
aliens. I'm not saying aliens. I'm saying they're a different
I'm
form
also
of
not,
human.
but I'm showing, the
Yeah.
mainstream, how it is labeling people who, oh, elongated skulls, some aliens, they are basically generalizing everything, and they are laughing, oh, idiots, etc. But actually, these skulls exist. Those depictions, they exist, and people just ask questions. Some people think these are aliens. Some people think this is another phenomenon or some, anything. It can be anything. We do not know much about that. And, this everything of that exists. So what's the problem? And I show that because, it is an interesting case. And in ancient Egypt, we have to mention that they put not only the perspective when it comes to depicting anyone on the reliefs, etc., but they also put metaphorical meanings. For instance, all the pharaohs were much larger than casual humans to show that they are superior. They were like on the equal side like gods. And if they put like casual humans with gods, the gods were also much higher. So it is a fact that they most probably were not realistic in this case, right? So they were just putting how high in a position of power is a person, so people were higher and people were lower. And that don't mean that, these were the giants, etc. Actually, because we know that some of the pharaohs depicted were actually very, very small. But when it comes to the Akhenaten, he made a huge reform of the religion. He started, venerating a single monotheistic deity. And what is interesting that he also reformed the art, and he wanted actually, and it is mentioned in the sources that he wanted to put, because always, the pharaohs, as I mentioned, they were bigger and they were also more pretty on the depictions that they were in reality. They were always, the actual tradition was to put the pharaoh to be as, the best as possible, even though the pharaoh was not looking that good. You know what I mean? So they were like making like a modern Photoshop or something.
Filters. They've got the Instagram, the social media filters on them.
That's a good a good example. But Akhenaten wanted to actually show as much to show everyone as much realistically as possible. And the question arises, if he wanted to show people realistically, so did he look like on this depiction? Did his family was so alien, or what is going on? And it shows us that, there weren't science fiction back then, and people may have an imagination, of course, but where was the inspiration for that kind of people and that kind of depiction of people? So it is very strange, and actually I'm laughing at this in my book because Pharaoh Akhenaten wanted actually to show people as realistically as possible. He wanted to stop, filtering everything and showing everyone fake at their best when they aren't. So what is going on here?
Well, the things I've read is that those, because you do find skulls which are elongated, but they're human skulls. They've been shaped. They bind the heads, and they get these strange shaped heads. Now, I understand, and that's the reason why they did that, is because they wanted to be as the gods were. So maybe in those days, the people with the larger skulls, the bigger brains, were the ones who were. Who knows? I'm just throwing this as an example, that they are the ones who designed these buildings, designed whatever it was, and life was great. And they thought, wow, these people are amazing and are like gods. Now, fair enough for that one.
Yeah, so but the last thing about that is that people, as I mentioned, the mainstream laughing at that, but people do not have imagination about the potentiality, because actually anatomically modern humans at some point in the prehistory, don't remember the exact date, but they coexisted with 5 another humanoid beings. Yeah. Like the Homo, even the like Homo flores, this Hobbit, Homo florensinensis, and Denisovans, and many other. Like it was 5 different species coexistent with humans. And modern skeptics are laughing at these stories that Akhenaten or some other people in the distant past were different than humans. But actually, what it was the case, because they see again from the modern perspective that we are the only humanoid intelligent species and only apes are after us, and apes are totally different. But as I mentioned, 5 different hominid species coexisted with us. So what if there was another maybe race or maybe species that was also capable of that? And another last thing is that, for instance, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest ancient texts in the world, there is a mention of Enkidu, and the description of Enkidu clearly fits for me a hominid that coexisted with humans. There is a mention that he was like a primitive, full of fur man that was intelligent like humans, but was primitive, like a little bit like a monkey, but somewhere between. It wasn't like chimpanzee or something. He was much more intelligent. He was actually, he could compare it. It could be compared to humans at that time. So it isn't only Akhenaten, it isn't only elongated skulls, but there is much more to that.
Mm-hmm. Funny, you mentioned that, because from what I read, I'm sure you know more about this than I do, but that Gilgamesh was a giant himself, and his friend Enkidu, well, he wasn't his friend to start off with. He was a wild man, and everyone was frightened of him. And then they had a wrestling match, and I think Gilgamesh won, and then they became friends and inseparable, man and beast. And whether that's an allegory of the duality of man, who knows? It's an interesting story, a very interesting story, because it includes what we'd call space flight. This is an old book. This is one of the oldest. In fact, I think it could be the oldest existing written story. But so I drove to Florence and back on Friday and came back yesterday. So that's 6 hours there, 6 hours back. And I listened to a succession of podcasts about evidence for giants. Now, this might lose a few people, but based on what I've been, I mentioned a few of the authors before who talked about these things. And there are thousands upon thousands of stories about people finding giant. And I'm not talking, 30-meter tall. We're talking a race of people. And this is where it starts to get really interesting, which doesn't seem to be in any doubt. Certainly not in my mind now, from after what I've been listening to, and assuming, of course, the sources are correct. But the sources are, universities in the United States. This is Smithsonian Institute in the United States, newspaper articles where they find giants. But like I said, they're not 10 meters high. They're not enormous statues, like huge statues we see from the past. But it's, between 7 and 9 feet tall. But they're big. They're human. They've got the same proportion as us. So they're not have the gigantism, I think it's called it, when you have deformities in your body because you're but these these are giant people who aren't particularly well, because they're not giant. They're giant because of something's wrong with them genetically. So these people are proportioned as we are, big. Now this is where it starts to get interesting. So and always the same story is that they are between 7 and 9 foot tall. Women the same. The women and the men are about the same size. They have reddish, blondish hair, and blue or light blue gray eyes, white skinned, and they're violent. They're very violent, and they are cannibals. Quite often they are cannibals, or most of the time they're cannibals. And the Native American Indians, as we would call them now, and these giants, these large people, were coming from, and so they did the DNA testing on these skeletons they find. They come from, the group come from Western Russia, so kind of Ukraine, Russia area. That is where they come from. Very big, made it the way all the way across between Siberia and Alaska, and then down into the United States. And all of the Indian oral tradition, so their history, oral history, mentions often, a lot of them mention the same thing, that they came from the West in reed boats, these giant big reed boats, which they built. They were excellent at fishing, but they were nasty. And it's so, I'm sitting there next to my wife, and I'm listening to it. She's not listening to it, and she's doing something else. And I'm saying, okay, now they've found a 9.5-foot skeleton, and now it turns out they're all cannibals. And so they have these stories where modern researchers will say, university scientists will go in and say, these oral traditions are not to be trusted because it's just, old tales. But one guy mentioned, one of the chiefs was talking about how there was a volcano nearby which erupted, and they're talking about the eruption of this volcano.
I mentioned this case in my book about this oral tradition, as an example of how long the oral tradition can be preserved. Yes,
exactly.
Yes.
So they said, and this volcano exploded, and it was 37,500 years ago. And then they checked that volcano, and the last time it erupted was 37,500 years ago. And you probably have the one about the Lovelock Cave, with the last stand of the giants versus the Indians in Nevada. And it was on this place called Humboldt Lake, which is dry now. And the last time, and this story is to the fact that the chief's daughter, the next, one of the high-ranking members of this tribe, the Paiute tribe, they say it's from like roughly 10,000 years ago, and they still have artifacts from this, which is passed down, venerated and passed down by generation to generation, because it was so important, because it was either us or them. They put these giants, they got them into they managed to get them into a cave, and they basically burnt them out. But they offered them, said, stop eating us, behave like humans and not like beasts, and we'll let you out. We'll put the fire out and you can come back out. But no, they didn't go for it. And so they was talking about Humboldt Lake having water. And then again, they checked this out. The last time it had water in it was 9,600 years ago. So it's for us in the West, it's hard to get our heads around to have such accurate oral history. But from what I've read, they picked, the brightest kids had to sit them down and they had to memorize this,
like
and then
the
pass it on to the
Quran.
next.
Even nowadays, the Quran is frequently memorized. And in my book, I show other examples. For instance, the Vedas. The Vedas are also one of the oldest texts, but actually, when it comes to the writing, when it comes to the text, like physical copies, they aren't that old, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, because the same with Mahabharata, for instance, one of the longest epics in the world and also one of the oldest. But actually, in India, not only ancient but medieval and even nowadays, but especially in the past, it was really venerated for someone, just as in the case of memorizing the Quran. It was very venerated that people, memorized everything. And, the Vedas initially were only an oral, they were only spoken, they weren't like written down for some people say even for tens of thousands of years. They there might have been not written down actually, and we know that they are much older. When scientists say that they are a much older oral tradition, even if you read the Vedas, they are not like text, but they feel like some incantations, etc. They feel very, very speakable, not like to be read exactly. But the same as we see in India, the same with the Quran, the same with many Native Americans, for instance. Nowadays we underestimate the oral narrative because we think that, it's not possible, people will make mistakes, they may convolute everything, etc. But actually, it was very different in the past, and we should actually accept that. And another version, for instance, Plato, the same Plato that wrote about Atlantis, is telling us about the myth of the Egyptian god of wisdom, Thoth, who after introducing the hieroglyphic script to ancient Egyptians very, very long ago, made people forget everything. It is also a kind of allegory of Plato that after the invention of writing, people started, losing their memory because everything was written down. People didn't need to memorize that many things. But it is, the same case everywhere. Ancient India, Native Americans, the Quran, that, before the script, the memory may have been much stronger in people and maybe much more important to people. Again, plenty of skeptics and plenty of people are seeing everything from the modern perspective of how the world works nowadays. But we see that just as nowadays there are different cultures that are functioning a little bit different, so maybe in the past it was the same case. And as I mentioned, many people see our history from, the present perspective. If the Big Bang happened, in a metaphorical case, it is much more, of course, advanced than that. But of course, Big Bang happened, everything started forming, planets, and life started evolving. If we see from this perspective everything is a constant evolution. But what if it is not? It is only, actually, I say it as, again, a metaphor, an allegory, that nowadays there are more and more theories showing us that the Big Bang may be just a cycle, that there is a Big Bang, and the Big Crunch, Big Bang, Big Crunch. There are different names, different theories on that, but it is cyclical. And if we see everything only from the small, short period from the beginning to nowadays, we see everything as evolution, and it shapes our ideas, it shapes our views about the universe. And if we saw that from the cyclical perspective, that okay, our universe, our part of the universe started with the Big Bang, but it is a constant cycle, just as seasons are cyclical and everything in nature is cyclical, then we would be able to interpret our past and everything differently. And that's why I called my book Deja, because everything already been, because I mentioned a lot the cycles of time. But I want to come back to giants again, the case that we interpret everything from our modern perspective, and we do not, when it comes to skeptics mostly, we do not have often imagination. But as I mentioned, if anatomically modern humans coexisted with 5 different species of hominids, including the Homo florensinensis, which is called Hobbit because it was 1 meter tall or something like, or even maybe smaller than that, but plus minus 1 meter tall compared to humans. So maybe there was another species that we haven't discovered yet of those giants who were a little bit, higher than that. Or maybe it were just humans with some genetic mutations, and those mutations are very, very incredible because, for instance, what caused anatomically modern humans? What was the source? We know genetically that we, for instance, why we are different than chimpanzees, because everyone is telling you, oh, we have 99% of the same DNA as chimpanzees, but it is a completely different story because, for instance, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And this is very important because, for instance, chimpanzees and those apes that are closest to us have 24 pairs. So 1 pair more of chromosomes. And why this is important? Because actually the very prehistoric fusions of those chromosomes with some kind of hominid or ape, or we do not know, but some species have, just like modern apes, a 1 pair of chromosomes more than us, but we know from our chromosomes that there was a fusion, and that's why we have a pair of chromosomes less, because it was chaotic and those chromosomes, 2 chromosomes were fused together. And we see that in the modern chromosomes, that some chromosomes are not like natural like other chromosomes, but they are fused. They have some parts of chromosomes that should be different chromosomes that should be separated. So we know that there was a huge fusion of chromosomes, but actually, what is the result of such a fusion? In modern days, we know that, for instance, like autistic people, like dumb people, and there are plenty of conditions that are handicapping people because they have like 1 chromosome less. But the prehistoric fusion did something completely different. It made us having a pair of chromosomes less, but actually that fusion caused like a boom in intelligence, boom in experiencing higher emotions like empathy, etc. So it is a very, very strange case. And what if there was another fusion mutation or something like that that caused those giants? So modern skeptics do not have enough imagination, and we can pinpoint, just as in the case of the oral narrative surviving for very, very long times, we can show plenty of examples that are comparable to the existence of giants. As I mentioned, fusion of chromosomes or gigantism, as some people speculate. We do not know much about the universe around us, and just because we made plenty of progress recently, actually, about the understanding of the universe, of the material part of the universe, we have a little bit pride and arrogance that now we are, at the tip and we know so much, and we think that, because the theories were so accurate up until nowadays about the universe or about the history, we think that, there won't be another anomaly that would throw those theories out. The question of paradigm shifts in history, but it is in science, but it is much more advanced for this conversation now. But coming back to giants, I think that it is quite possible for that. And the last things, because those questions that you ask are for me very multi-dimensional, plenty of different threads. But another thing you mentioned, tall people, giants, red or blonde hair and blue eyes, the famous Aryan people, they would call us racist after this conversation, because if you mention these kinds of people or Aryan race, you are immediately called racist. But actually, it is a fact that we find those people, and these are just theories of how we interpret those data. We know, for instance, that those people are often found, the skeletons of those people are often found, like when it comes to the Atlantic Ocean, we find it on the shores, like on the Canary Island, in Morocco, in Spain, in Portugal, and on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, we find it on the coasts of especially North America. We find some people see that it is the same haplogroup, etc., but it is much more advanced than that. But modern science ignores that because it is too much connected to Nazis and their ideas about Aryan people, because actually there were plenty of different thoughts about the Aryan people during the Nazi time. The mainstream one was that, those Aryans that we're mentioning, maybe those giants also, because there were also that tall Aryans were the true race. So, unfortunately, Nazis were so ideological that they wanted to, make space for those true people and eliminate others. But actually, there were different theories about why those Aryans were actually the first race. And some proponents told actually that those Aryans were actually from Atlantis. It was one, there were different roads to the Aryan theory. One, it was from Atlantis. Another, like the mainstream Hitler one, was that it was just Germanic race, etc. That the true Germans, etc. Which I think even the Atlantis one is more plausible in this case. And the other one was actually that they were from Hyperborea, or even the most extreme one, that they were from the inner earth, from the Agartha. And actually Ahnenerbe, during the Nazi times, there was an institution called the Ahnenerbe. They were traveling all over the world in search of the artifacts, just as in the Indiana Jones. They wanted to prove that the Aryan race was the superior one, and that it was the most ancient one, either from Atlantis, or that it was the first race, the true humans, and the rest of the humans are like worse than the Aryans. So that's what it's all about.
But I wasn't expecting to go in this direction. I will do it. So that's one theory. The other theory is based on Edgar Cayce, the famous psychic reader, who gave lots of predictions, and we talked about not just Atlantis, but even older cultures. But he said that the Atlanteans were the North American race, so like what we call the American Indians now. Mm-hmm. Is that they were the red race, as they called them. Not his words, not mine, by the way. Just that's what he was saying. But Alex, ultimately we know that all these genetic manipulations were done by aliens, right? Yes. No,
we do not know. The probability of that is so huge that could be even either God, aliens, or just nature.
I don't, I'm just joking when I say that, but I find it interesting, and I find this, and I can feel it when if something so traumatic. So say you were the Paiute tribe, that it was so important for you that you got your kids and said, right, memorize this story and you pass it down through the generation, because this was so serious to us that we were getting killed and eaten regularly by these big bastards that we had to kill them all. We had to burn them in a cave. And that story, so it serves as, this is, don't get complacent because you must survive, because this happened in the past. Same with, so talking about the importance of passing the oral tradition also goes to why the Egyptians and the not just their civilization, but elsewhere around the world did it in stone, because they knew that cataclysms were coming, and if it was going to be by fire or by flood, whatever it was going to be, usually they're one every 12,000 years. So I guess we're due one around about now. And they know that after a few thousand years, like you've already mentioned, that there's no sign of civilization. Our civilization is wiped out. However, if you build stuff out of very hard rock, then you're good, and if you're writing on rock, you're good. Metal, no, doesn't work. So it's, what are they trying to tell us? And this is one thing I think I'm starting to understand why is it the ancient civilizations were so obsessed with not astrology, meaning the study of the stars and the cycles and the heavens, as a big time clock, as a large clock, because they knew that in approximately this many thousands of years, that cycle was going to repeat, because we've got this information from our forefathers, our forebears, to say that this is going to happen. So you need to do something about it. You got to be prepared. You see what I mean? It's important stuff. And they made it it was such an important thing for them, because it was a catastrophic thing that wiped the slate clean all across Earth, that maybe only 10% or even less sometimes of the human population survived. And we are, you and I, all of us are descendants of the last cataclysm approximately 12,000 years ago. And we are descendants of the survivors of a catastrophe that killed 90% of the world's population.
We do not know how many actually, but
but a lot.
Estimates. Yes, that's why my book is actually called Deja Vu Has Everything Already Been.
Exactly.
Not only as a meaning that, maybe civilizations, maybe as advanced as our modern one, or just civilizations deja vu, because it's always happening, rises and falls of civilizations, etc. But also because I talk a lot about what you mentioned about the cycles of time. And as I mentioned before, in the case of the Big Bang, we see it only from one point, that it is expanding, and we see the evolution on Earth that is expanding, and we think that our history is like a linear, constant progress. And this is the main, idea of the modern world, most popular, most
in the West.
Widely in the West, yes, exactly. But actually, if we look at our history, there were different ones. For instance, during the medieval times, there was a completely opposite vision. Just as today it is a constant progress, in the medieval times it was a fall. Even historically, it is often called a vision of the fall, that there was some huge point, golden age, Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, they sinned, and nowadays humanity is constantly falling. And we see that these visions are actually, controlling what we do as humanity, because nowadays, if we think of constant progress, we see that in technology and everything, we want more, and it isn't always good, because it can also lead to greed, more, exploiting more, doing more things that are sometimes unnecessary. I think that the modern constant progress, forceful progress, is also not a good concept, not in harmony with the universe. But again, during the Middle Ages, the vision of the fall was that casual people, there was some progress overall, but the progress was much less than during the ancient times. Actually, I think I could theorize that the Dark Ages are called Dark Ages because it was a dark period in our history. the ancient times were a little bit advanced, and then the Dark Ages was a fall of civilization after the end of both the Roman empires. After all of the vandalism, all of the barbarians, many things were lost, and we were in the Dark Ages. It was actually the regress of civilization, and then after the Middle Ages, we've got the Renaissance coming back to the ancient roots, and making a progress again, and that continued up until nowadays approximately. But we see that the vision of the fall that was in the Western world, especially in Europe at that time, was so dominant that people were living in that very, very dark vision. And the same today, if we think of the constant progress, we are living in that kind of vision. But there were other, for instance, the cyclical time. Just as in the nature there are cycles, life and death, there are different seasons, etc. Everything is, in that way. It is a natural way to live in cyclical reality, actually. And as I mentioned, everything is most probably cyclical because more and more theories are pointing out that there is a Big Bang and some kind either of big crunch or some other collapse of the universe, and then everything happens again. Just as in the Hindu text, there is a mention that everything comes from Brahman, the source, the consciousness, according to them, and after some time, everything comes back to it, like a heartbeat. There is a expansion contraction. So I think that it is a natural way, and like in fractals we see at many levels the same way. All the shapes are the same, like my veins, my blood vessels are the same, like rivers, or the same like in the bigger universe some stars are aligning in that way. The same is with time. If there is a cyclical universe, or if it is expansion and contraction, the same is at every level of our time, not history, but actually at every level of our time. When we see our lives, we see cycles within our lives, because we often call in spirituality karmic cycles or things like that, but we see that we have some psychological cycles, and we see that we are sometimes growing out from previous like our mental models, and we are going and evolving, but still within the cycles. And the same on the universe. In ancient Greece, it was that time is cyclical. In ancient India, it was, you mentioned yugas with Michael Lefland, and everything is cyclical. And you mentioned that every 12,000 approximately years there is a cataclysm. It is a theory that is based on facts, on the so-called precession of the equinoxes, which is a real astronomical phenomenon, real cycle called the precession of the equinoxes. 25,920 years it lasts for that. It is one big cycle, and you mentioned 12,000 years, which is approximately half of that cycle. So according to this theory, every half of the cycle there will be a catastrophe. And because Atlantis was approximately half of the cycle ago, about 12,000 years, so maybe nowadays or in the future there will be another cycle. But the fact is that it is based on ancient knowledge about the zodiacal epochs, because the precession of the equinoxes is showing us that every a few thousand years there is a different constellation of the zodiac on the horizon, because we've got 12 signs, according nowadays, 12 signs of the zodiac. We can divide it in 36 or 24 or 13 as someone, but let's see 12 signs of the zodiac. 12 signs of the zodiac, every this 25,920 years is about 2,000 years per zodiac sign. And nowadays we are speaking of the age of Aquarius. And as you see, Aquarius, and 2,000 years ago, with the birth of Christ, with the times of Christianity, Christ, there was a fish, because before that it was the age of Pisces, and the fish was representing that. I am showing that a lot in my book. And 2,000 years before that, it was, I think, the age of Aries. And that's why in the Bible, in the biblical stories, Aries was so popular. They were sacrificing Aries in many parts of the Mesopotamia, because before Christ there was the age of Aries, and before that, with the first civilizations of India, Egypt, and Sumer, there was the age of Ram, of Taurus. So that's why the cattle was so important, and this symbolism was depicted throughout the ages. That's why nowadays we are on the verge, or maybe actually in the age of Aquarius, because it is under age approximately 2,000 years. And in my book, in I think last chapter, or before the last chapter, I saw plenty of examples that history is actually repeating over exact cycles of the zodiac over this 25,920 years, which is a large number. Let's approximate it for 26,000 years to be, for easy math. 26,000 years. If we divide that into 12 signs of the zodiac, it is 2,160 years per zodiac cycle. And I'm showing in my book a few cases of repeating history that it repeats this exact number of years per zodiac cycle. And it isn't that one event is repeated after one zodiac cycle. It is that, a huge amount of events spanning 20, 50, 60 years are repeating in the next zodiac cycle within a month of accuracy if you want to calculate the years. So it is these are very amazing stories that are repeated from the ancient times into the modern era. The same leaders, the same mistakes being made, the same wars being started, the same nations, not the same nations, but the same archetypal nations.
Yeah.
Scenarios like, Nazis were like that, and Hannibal was very evil. So the Nazis, the Hitler was the Hannibal, ancient Carthage at his times, etc. I am exploring all of that with plenty of details in my book, but it is amazing. And this knowledge about the precession of the equinoxes and these cycles of times was encoded in ancient texts, in the Rig Veda, in many Hindu texts. It was encoded in the Great Pyramid of Giza, and it is much more than that, and it is too much for today for this conversation. But this is, it is a huge knowledge. That's why my book is not only about lost history, lost civilizations, but also about the cycles of time, cyclical history, and, much more in-depth knowledge, that it is not only about, as I say, understanding of our history, but a knowledge that will help to navigate in the universe. And to conclude that, and to show a similar thing to your previous conversation about the Yuga cycles with Michael Leflam. Actually, in Mahabharata, one of the oldest ancient texts in the world, just as Epic of Gilgamesh, but here in India, in Mahabharata, Yugas are the first time explained, and they are not explained just that these are the cycles, there is one age, there is second age, etc., but they are explained as an instruction manual on how to navigate during a certain age. So if you have an instruction manual that during this age it is good to do those things, and there would be things like that happening, not the exact, but some motives, some scenarios similar to that will be happening, like archetype. We've got in psychology archetypes that are like universal motives. So the same as with Yugas mentioned that during Kali age there will be this motive, during the entire era in another age will be this motive, and you should do like that. It would be the best, but you can do whatever you want. But these are like what is good. It is about dharma, what is lawful, what is good, what is the necessity. In ancient hermetic texts from Egypt, it was called necessity, that sometimes you are not arrogant, I can do whatever I want, but in some cases, in some situation, there is a necessity, that it is the best to do like that. It is the best to work like that, or to make decisions like that, etc. So it is much more than that, and that's why this knowledge, as I mentioned, is important, whether in understanding the catastrophes that are cyclical, or whether understanding how it is good to live during certain ages. And it was all encoded in ancient texts, but unfortunately nowadays, when it comes to the mainstream, of course, we've forgotten it all, and we are just arrogant, making constant progress that may lead to our destruction.
Yeah, it's interesting that the Big Bang was the only part of the universe that doesn't adhere to the laws of physics, which is that everything operates in cycles. So so that's why I was thinking about that. As this goes bang, it expands, but there's no contraction. I don't buy it. I don't buy it. It's the only thing in the universe that doesn't adhere to cycles, if that's the case. So because the Big Bang, why, to clarify the Big Bang at the singularity, you mentioned this initial phase that there were no laws of physics because there were no space-time. Only from the singularity space-time expanded with the loss of physics after that, and when it crunches, it goes back to the singularity and it goes back to no loss. And then, the loss in the different cycle could be different. Maybe that's why there are so many mentions in Mahabharata or Hindu texts
of some psychic abilities that are extreme, like not just Casey, but they're extreme, or some flying machines, etc. Because maybe these are memories from the previous universe in which the laws of physics were different. So it goes that it is just our universe, our material universe, that science is actually based on. Science is based only on the material universe, but when it will crunch, maybe, at the end, and then it will expand again, there would be completely different universe, and science would be completely different in the next cycle, unfortunately.
Well, there you go. That is I have to, number one, I need to read your book, which is what I'm going to do straight away. It's a holiday today, so everyone. I can sit outside in the sun. Deja Vu has everything already been, by Aleksander Czeszkiewicz. Uncover the biggest, what was it on the back? It doesn't matter, I bet.
No problem.
So, you have a website? Do you have a social medias? People can find your book?
Yes, just type or copy and paste my name and surname, you will find me.
I'll put a link.
That's no problem.
Yeah.
Yes.
I put a link. I followed you on Instagram this morning, so if you follow it, I can then tag you.
Okay.
Mr. Kindness _pod is us, MISTER, kindness _pod. And absolute pleasure to have you. Remarkable young man, 21-year-old that has this kind of knowledge. I'm very late to the game, but I find it so interesting. I think it's always been in me. I just haven't really got into it until relatively recently. And it's just a lot of fun, you know. It's a lot of fun just for your imagination to run wild. And I appreciate people like you doing the work that you do. And thank you again for coming on and being a guest on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and let's do this again anytime you want, mate.
Okay, no problem.
We can go as crazy as you like. We can go as deep rabbit hole as you like. I like that. All right, Aleksander, take care. Thanks again, and thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.